Welcome, everyone. I think this is one of a number. Kevin Jones, at this point, I'm not sure for how long we are, but we've been doing this symposium for a number of years, hosted by VLS and hosted by a number of VLS alumni and other experts in the energy sector. And I can't tell you how useful I found these to be, as have our students, our alumni, and practicing lawyers. Particularly energy lawyers in the DC area, and how thrilled I am to be able to start. Unfortunately, I won't be able to stay for the whole program today, except to jump on another call. But I do want to call out a couple of thank yous and then turn it over. First of all, I want to thank Dan Phillips, who has not been able to join us yet because of some technical difficulties, but he will soon. And Dan, when you do, feel free to jump in after me. I also want to thank our alumnus, Brian Potts from the Perkins Coie law firm for sponsoring the symposium this year. Perkins Coie is a great law firm, and I tried to do legal work in the Northwestern United States when I lived in Southern California. And every time I'm about to get a retention, they'd say to me, oh, well, we're already using Perkins Coie and we're very happy with them. So that's a really good sign. Dan, I want to mention, is the founding chairman of our VLS alumni in energy, and I want to thank him for all of his leadership. We have a number of our alums who are participating in the panel today, and I'm not going to call them out specifically, but you can see in both the program materials, and you will hear from them shortly. I also want to highlight the topic of today's seminar, and it couldn't be more timely given the upcoming election and the debates we're having about what a clean energy future would look like. I'm deeply proud of our energy program, the Institute for Energy Environment at the school, under the leadership of Kevin Jones, who's with us today. And one of the great things about it is how hands-on it is, how practical it is, and how much it allows our students to get right to work and use their degrees right out of school. So it's been terrific for us. But we welcome your involvement and engagement. If you're not a VLS alum, you can still help us out and be involved. This is almost certainly the most dynamic and interesting area of the larger set of environmental law issues these days, and that applies both nationally and internationally. I can't think of a better topic for us to be covering. So I'll stop there. Thank you all. Dan Phillips, if you are with us, jump in. And if you are not, I am not sure I'm handing it over to next.
Thanks, everyone, for being here with us this afternoon. As Dean McHenry mentioned, this is one of the most dynamic areas, at least in my mind, and I'm biased, of environmental law right now. It's changing on a daily and weekly basis. It's very exciting. It's very important. It's clean energy work is at the center of our fight against climate change, and I'll get more into that in just a few minutes, as well as our panelists. So I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Samantha Williams. I'm with the Natural Resources Defense Council, and I'm located in Chicago. I direct the Climate and Clean Energy Program for the Midwest region for NRDC. I'm also a VLS alum, class of 05. 15 years have really gone by in a flash. We have a really impressive panel of clean energy experts and VLS alumni with us today. Before I introduce them, I wanted to offer a few opening thoughts to kick things off. In terms of logistics for the next hour, please post any questions you have to the chat. As they come up, you can post them throughout the moderated discussion, and we'll be monitoring things there. We're going to have a moderated discussion for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have another 30 minutes at the end for audience questions, and we'll be using the chat box to source those questions. So please drop in whenever you can, and whatever you'd like to ask our panelists. So a few remarks to set the tone and the context for this panel today. This discussion today focuses on COVID-19 and the clean energy transition. We're going to be talking with our panelists about the impacts of COVID on the clean energy industry and on the transition. So not just renewables, but also electrification, which is another very important part of that transition. And what's really happened over the last 7 months from a few different perspectives. We have a speaker from the private sector, a large scale renewables developer. We have a speaker from the utility world, a vertically integrated multi-jurisdictional utility, and then we have the governmental perspective from the state of California. And we're going to talk also about where is the industry headed? What does the future look like for this transition at the state and the local level? And obviously at the federal level too. Dean McHenry mentioned this, but there is this specter hanging over us of next week's election that is looming large over these discussions. So just a few observations before I hand things off to our panelists. We are in the midst of a paradigm shift in the clean energy industry. In the last decade, we've seen huge growth in the availability and cost effectiveness of renewables, and also in electric vehicles and other clean energy technology. And in particular, wind and solar costs have plummeted in the last decade. And we've also seen renewables deployment during that time nearly double. And we're really in what some folks are calling this age of 100% clean, or age of net zero. We're seeing this shift in the cost picture give way to policy commitments all over the place across the country, at the state level, the local level, and utilities. And that transition is really happening in a big way. Just a few years ago, commitments to a clean power sector and going really deep on cutting carbon, or even going to net zero, they were outliers even just 3 or 4 years ago. And now it's a verified sea change. At the state level, at last count, there were more than 24 states, and there's probably actually more now because this keeps changing, that have made commitments to deeply cut greenhouse gas emissions from their electric power production, anywhere from 80% all the way to 100% and net zero. That trend is also on display with utilities. We have more than 30 utilities with similar commitments across the country, with at least an 80% CO2 reduction commitment by mid-century or even earlier, and some have gone much further in their ambition. And then of course, cities, we've heard a lot about how cities have really led the way in this clean energy revolution. There's more than 100 cities with specific 100% renewables goals, and that is an underestimate, of course. Some of this paradigm shift has been driven by cost declines in renewables and battery technology, et cetera, but it's also been driven by a new sense of urgency to act on the climate crisis. I'm sure everyone on this webinar today is familiar with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. There was a report that the panel released in 2018, which set out an imperative that has really set the tone for the industry to limit average global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And we're seeing the need for that ambition with our own eyes now. Climate change is here. 7 months into this year, into this pandemic, we're seeing the rapid advance of wildfires, extreme weather events. We had the derecho here in the Midwest a few months ago, and it confirms the need to accelerate the transition to clean energy. And we're also seeing how the public health effects of COVID and racial and economic disparities that have been laid bare in the last few months have only been amplified by the effects of the climate crisis. In terms of the science and the level of ambition we're talking about, the industry is moving fast, and it needs to move even faster. And that's not just power production, it's also across the entire economy. Transportation, buildings, industry, ag. We're talking now about economy-wide targets. And I think that's really what the IPCC made clear in their last report, is that we have to think bigger. And that has driven a new wave of commitments in the last few years from states that are going beyond the power sector, and now they're looking economy-wide, and they're pulling in those other big sectors of emitting greenhouse gases. And so you have California, New York, Michigan on that list that are setting that much higher level of ambition across the entire economy to cut emissions. And then finally, before I hand things off, I wanted to note the economic juggernaut that is the clean energy workforce, which I know our panelists will speak to. At the start of this year, there were over 3 million workers in the clean energy industry nationally. And that's according to an annual Clean Jobs America report that is published by Environmental Entrepreneurs, E2. But another piece of sobering data that I wanted to share, also from E2, is what's happened since COVID. So in the first 3 months of COVID, March, April, and May, the industry experienced some really devastating job losses. 600,000 clean energy workers were laid off in that period. Thankfully, that picture has started to turn around. That started in the summer. with each month progressively gaining some of those jobs back. The recovery has been slow, but it's not back to where it was, at least from the view of these national numbers. I know that our panelists will speak to how they're viewing those impacts on the ground. So I'd like to now introduce our three speakers. We're going to start with Carter Scott, who is a VLS alum, class of '06. Carter is the Vice President of Operations and supports the Vice President of Operations for Ranger Power, and she supports the Ranger Power team in all aspects of renewables development. She oversees interconnection and transmission, compliance, real estate management, and corporate operations. We also have Spencer Haynes, VLS class of '04. Spencer's at Duke Energy Renewables, where he's a managing director of renewables policy. He provides state policy and government relations counsel across more than 20 states. And then finally, last but not least, we have Hannah Goldsmith, who is a VLS alum of 2013. Hannah is with the state of California. She is the lead advisor for the Zero Emission Vehicle Market Development at California's Office of Business and Economic Development, which stands for GoBiz, where she focuses on expanding and accelerating the state's zero emission vehicle market, a very important role. Just a quick factoid about Hannah, because we talked about sharing some VLS facts, is that she's a native of Arizona, and when she moved to Vermont, she had to buy snow boots for the first time. And I can certainly relate to that. After I graduated from Vermont, I moved to California the day after graduation before coming to the Midwest 10 years ago, and threw all of my snow boots out. So I can relate, Hannah. All right, with that, I'm going to pass things off to Carter, and we'll get started with our discussion.
Great. Can everyone hear me okay? We got a thumbs up. Good.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. So, wow, yeah, it's been about 15 years since I left Vermont Law School and launched a little career in renewable energy. I've been focusing or specializing, if you will, in kind of interconnection and transmission and how renewable projects actually integrate into and connect to the transmission system. So I have not been practicing law, which is, I think, a somewhat typical VLS trajectory, but have really enjoyed sort of learning more about renewable energy and I'm really my team that I work with is really kind of on the ground, doing renewable energy development. So we're securing land and permits and interconnection agreements, power purchase agreements, to pull together sort of the package that is a renewable energy project that will ultimately be constructed, operational, and start to sort of build that energy transition that I think we're all working towards. And I think to share a couple of sort of perspectives that we have on the COVID impacts, I think everybody talks about, issues with Zoom and sort of where we're going and how do we deal with this new technology and being remote. Renewable energy development, at least the way that we sort of practice development, is really kind of on the ground, and it's getting to know landowners and local communities and the town official in a town where they don't have Wi-Fi in their local building, or it's still the DSL dial-up. So I think that's really been one of the biggest impacts for us, is that our work and being able to build the partnerships and the stakeholder relationships to get these projects moving and supported in their local communities, which is really the most sort of important tenet of our work, has been definitely impacted by that. And I will say, sort of on top of that, not to get too political, but in Michigan, for example, Governor Whitmer has issued over 200 executive orders over the last 10 months or so to try and just manage the way that their state is dealing with COVID. And one of those was to allow townships and local communities to house virtual hearings and meetings. And so we have, tried to shift to the best that we can to that sort of virtual platform. The Supreme Court overturned almost all of her executive orders recently, and it was reversed by legislative action. But again, sort of how all these communities and our sort of work is trying to kind of adapt to and deal with a new environment is really challenging. So I think, just to give you a perspective of sort of the development work that we're doing and how COVID has impacted that, I think that's been probably the biggest impact. And I think just another sort of thought on top of that I did want to share and that we talked about as a panel as we were sort of preparing for this, is that, COVID has shown an incredibly stark discrepancy between economically challenged communities and communities of color, and those sort of disparities. I mean, COVID has just sort of really wrecked those communities in a way that I think maybe not surprising, but is challenging. And as we transition sort of our new energy future, I hope that everyone just thinks about that in terms of how energy has I think caused the same sort of impacts in its development over the last 50, 100 years. And I hope that that's sort of a part of how we think about moving beyond COVID and into the energy future that we're all looking for. So it's not just about carbon, but how we treat all the humans and keep them healthy. So just want to share that, and please vote.
Thanks, Carter. We'll hear next from Spencer.
Great. It's really been great to see Carter and Sam and Dan and meet Hannah, and sort of scrolling through all the names here, and it's fun to see names that I remember. I had a really great Vermont Law School experience. Got my joint degree there, and moved down to North Carolina a couple of years later. Worked at the law school for a couple of years, and ended up going back to school and getting my MBA. And that's what led me into energy. And what was so exciting is that my law school degree and my master's in environmental law and policy probably differentiated me when I was interviewing at Duke Energy. But the MBA sort of opened the door for me. But it was my law school degrees from Vermont Law School that really has helped me succeed here. I've been at Duke for about 12 years, and it's been a great ride. We have made lots of advances in renewable energy, and we'll get into some of that a little later. But I just want to say a couple words about my law school experience. I played ultimate frisbee with a couple of the folks up here, although Sam claimed she didn't remember any of the rules, which is not true. But it's just such a special place, and it's really great to be invited to participate in this energy symposium. So thanks for inviting me, Dan, and and I look forward to the discussion. In terms of, I work at Duke Energy. We're one of the largest electric utilities in the country. We also have a development arm, so we're also an IPP, I suppose, and that's really where I spend the bulk of my work. But I do want to say a couple of things about the utility business model and the challenges we've faced through COVID. And I think it also, first we have to say, we're not quite through this thing yet. We're at record cases. The death rate may not be as high, but we're in the middle of a rising spike in COVID cases across the country. So I was kind of hoping this symposium would be after the election and after COVID, but that this is the world we get. So a couple of things utilities have done. A lot of them have voluntarily suspended shutoffs for customers, especially those customers who are in a real great need. So we've been pretty flexible with our customers, but as you can imagine, a lot of utilities have hundreds of millions of dollars of accrued bills that we're now sort of trying to figure out the best way to work with our customers to get them to pay some of their bill, but also keep their power on. So that's sort of the first challenge I think people may not always think about, but it's hit people who are economically disadvantaged particularly hard. The second thing is that construction projects. So we're building wind and solar projects right now. And while we're not stopping construction, there's definitely been some impact in the timing of those projects. We're not slowing down, but there are delays that come from ships taking longer to get to the United States, or materials having a harder time. We want to make sure our employees and our contractors are safe. So we're doing mandatory temperature checks every day. And then when we do have cases, we have to shut the site down and make sure we get everybody tested. And we have been really aggressive and responsible around testing people when we do have a COVID case. And, my hat's off to my colleagues who have been really aggressive about that to make sure people are safe. So I think the efforts for going through for clean energy are really, they're positive over the long run. This is not going to slow down the clean energy transition. But as I do state government policy work across 20 states, I will tell you there are big budget deficits that are being projected for next year. So that's a big concern of mine, and a concern of a lot of the states that we're operating in. And I'll leave it there, Sam.
Thanks, Spencer. And just to clarify, it's not that I don't remember the rules of Ultimate Frisbee, it's that I never cared about them in the first place. So just wanted to clear the air on that. Thanks, Spencer. Hannah, off to you.
Great, thanks. And I'm really the odd one out here because I did not play Ultimate Frisbee during my time at Vermont Law School, which I never regretted until this panel. So I'm going to have to look into that and the rules. But I'm Hannah Goldsmith, as Sam mentioned. I'm the lead advisor for zero emission vehicle market development at the California Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. It's a mouthful, so we call it GoBiz because that's much easier. And we likewise have been seeing a lot of the same impacts that my fellow panelists mentioned in the zero emission vehicle space. And I'll just clarify for folks on the phone, in California, zero emission vehicles are considered plug-in electric vehicles as well as hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. So I usually refer to them collectively as zero emission. But we've certainly seen impacts in the market from sort of the manufacturing sense of the actual vehicles. I think one interesting pivot that we've seen with the manufacturers of zero emission vehicles is to be able to use their facilities to produce personal protective equipment. I actually was at a doctor's appointment recently and saw that the mask the nurse I was talking to was wearing had a BYD logo on it, which is a manufacturer of zero emission transit buses and other trucks. So that was actually sort of a neat pivot, although that represents a slowdown in manufacturing the zero emission vehicles that we need. When the lockdown first started in California and across other states, we saw a sort of decrease in folks buying vehicles as well as using public transit and impacts of that nature. As the lockdowns have been lifted or people have started moving around again, we're seeing that pick back up with a lot of interest in zero emission vehicles. One interesting note in California is in some of our areas that are hit with the worst air quality. When the lockdown first started, because folks weren't driving as much, the air quality significantly improved in those areas. And that really has spurred more of an interest for consumers in zero emission vehicles and understanding the tie-in between the pollution coming from the transportation sector and how we can remedy some of that. So we're seeing sort of a pick back up. I think another interesting piece is on the charging infrastructure side. We did some modeling to see how the pandemic has impacted the construction and rollout of electric vehicle charging stations. And we're actually seeing that construction-wise and the opening of charging stations were on track or even slightly ahead of where we were this time last year. And that was as of a couple months ago. So that's positive. We're seeing that local jurisdictions are having to change what they're doing in terms of permitting. We're seeing a lot more permitting move to online, which helps move construction forward faster. So that's one benefit and adaptation from the pandemic that is helping the market in sort of a sea of bad news, trying to highlight a few positive things that we're seeing. But certainly, I think one of our biggest concerns from the state government side is the impacts on state budgets, because a lot of that money will need to be reallocated to help with impacts of the pandemic. And so it's sort of uncertain what that means for a lot of the clean energy funded activities, particularly if they relied on general fund versus sort of special dedicated funds. But California has continued to move forward with policies. We had a recent executive order that I can talk about later on zero emission vehicles and a lot of regulatory movement as well on the zero emission vehicle side. And thanks for having me. Really glad to be here.
Thank you, all three of you, for that introduction on where things currently stand. I'd like to dig in a little deeper into how you see things going over the next few months and over the next year. Let's start with the state and local level, just for a minute, kind of put the fact of next week's election aside, and we'll get to that. I'm curious, given the urgency of climate change, but also the COVID impacts that you all highlighted, how do we go even faster with this transition, regardless of what happens next week with the election, with the federal election? You know, what are the opportunities at the state and local level? And then if you can, also, what are the hurdles? So I'd love to hear from all three of you. Let's go in order. Let's start with Carter.
Sure. So, it's funny, I've worked, I've obviously had sort of a background in New England, where I think there's was sort of some of the original RPS and RGGI initiatives. And I think really sort of got started believing, as many of us did, that that's, really a strong driver and a necessary driver for a lot of the shift to renewable energy. And I still think that's the case. I don't want to say that I sort of have lost faith, although maybe I have a little bit. But I wanted to sort of provide the perspective from where I'm working now, which is in a lot of the Midwestern states that have not gone through full restructuring. There's still sort of a lot of vertically integrated utilities. Sort of the older school kind of electric regulatory schemes there. And politics that are not necessarily, they're not a huge amount of RPS standards. The small RPS standards that they have been met already. But I will say that I'm just seeing a huge groundswell of both sort of corporate and other customers who are pushing for renewables. I think a citizenry that's really pushing for the kind of economic development activity that they see a promise in renewable energy. And I think we're sort of seeing that shift where maybe the kind of political policy round is starting to sort of lag a little bit behind kind of the consumer and the sort of on the ground push. So maybe that's just a glimmer of hope that, even if the federal and state governments, I know California is sort of its own case, but if the federal and state governments, for some reason are not pushed into some massive new era of RPS or other sort of policies, that I really do think that we've kind of hit a critical mass on the other side and will sort of push through this. So just a perspective from outside of the sort of East and West Coast big state policies pushing these renewables and that kind of carbon-free future.
Thanks, Carter. What about from the utility perspective, Spencer?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I think, since I've joined Duke, we have retired over 50 coal units. Which is pretty remarkable. And, some of those were older plants. Some of those were retirements we made because it made sense to do it. But I think regardless of what happens next week with the federal election or state elections, there's a lot of state elections next week as well, utilities are going to continue to move to decarbonize. 5 or 10 years ago, there was a smaller group of utilities that were moving in that direction. But I'm not sure what it was, but maybe it's cost coming down for wind and solar, but we're no longer in the world where state RPS laws are driving deployment of renewables. We're in the world where renewables are getting deployed because they're a low cost resource. And so utilities are trying to balance the mix of wind and solar with their existing fleet. And they're also trying to figure out, what the future looks like. And we do that through integrated resource planning. And hats off to our IRP team at Duke Energy. We put out 6 different futures this year. I think it's the first time we've done that. We usually pick a future that tries to balance all the different interests of people who are more cost sensitive, folks who want clean energy, folks who just want the reliability. But this year we put out a future showing 6 different futures. Some of those were no gas, some of them were high wind, some of them were low or all solar. And what you really see is, a potential for a mix of different resources over the next 10 years so that we can balance the grid and we can provide reliable, cost-effective, but also clean energy to our customers. So that's being done. We're doing that because it's the right thing to do. There's not a law in North Carolina that says we need to do it, or in South Carolina. We're doing it because we think it's the right thing to do for our customers, but also for the environment. There are hurdles, and I mentioned them one earlier, which is state budget deficits. And I think depending on the amount of experience a state has with wind and solar and other technologies, they're either going to be bullish on these technologies or they're going to pull back. But we're going to continue to see deployment. I just think there might be a slight dip in the next year or so because there are significant challenges with state budgets. And I think I'll leave it there. I did see a question about cybersecurity in the chat, and of course, cybersecurity is really important for utilities. I think the utilities that have nuclear plants in their fleet, which we're one of the largest nuclear operators in the country, we take that even more seriously. We have phishing tests on employees all the time, and we've got a great IT team that keeps everybody on our toes. But we moved about 16,000 employees to virtual, to working from home over a weekend. So, I think utilities, whether it's responding to storms or it's responding to COVID, we're always up for a challenge, and I'm really proud of the way Duke has stepped up in the last 6 or 7 months.
I wanted to ask a follow-up, Spencer, but I'm going to go to Hannah and then we'll come back and see if it feels still relevant. So Hannah, would you like me to repeat the question, or are you good to go?
I think I'm good. I'd like to come at this sort of from, so our office, although we're called Business and Economic Development, we're sort of a overseeing entity of state policy around zero emission vehicles. So we have kind of that business economics lens, but also the environmental policy lens, which I don't think are separate, but in terms of talking about how we move the market in those ways, the policy tools are often different. And from the business and economics perspective, when we're looking at fleets and consumers looking to purchase a zero emission vehicle, we are similar to what Spencer was outlining. We're seeing that it makes sense for folks. For fleets, the fueling cost can be way cheaper than using gas or diesel. The maintenance costs are significantly lower. There is an upfront hurdle for the purchase price, obviously, and it's hard for folks to sort of stomach that and put that into context with the savings that come later. So we have policies to overcome that with rebates and other incentives. But I think from that perspective and the market and economics perspective, it just continues to make sense and make more sense, which is really helpful when you're trying to move folks to a cleaner technology. From the environmental perspective, as folks probably know, California, as well as almost half of the states in our country, are suing the Trump administration over many environmental rollbacks, clean cars being one of those. So we'll continue to fight that. We have California as a state, as well as other states, have a good history of continuing to have that authority to set our own clean car standards because of our unique air quality challenges in California. Obviously, if we had a different administration, and that's what we're hoping for following the election, we would like to have that support and that belief in protecting the planet from the federal administration. That would make our lives so much easier, but we will continue to move forward with or without them. So I think on the federal side, we'd like to see stimulus packages that have clean energy components that could help move the market forward for everything that we're talking about today. But on the state side, we'll continue to enact regulations and to the extent we can make our budgets work, incentives for the clean energy transition. Our governor just a little over a month ago signed an executive order that requires in the state of California as of 2035, all new passenger cars and light trucks have to be zero emission to be sold starting in 2035. So it's not a ban, as folks like to say, on operating a combustion engine vehicle if you're a consumer. It just says that the sales starting then need to be zero emission. So that yields consumers having more choice in the zero emission options and really motivates manufacturers and folks to get those vehicles ready over the course of time until 2035. We also put in place medium and heavy duty targets that really mirror what our California Air Resources Board has adopted. There's the Advanced Clean Trucks regulation, which seeks to transition our trucking fleet to zero emission vehicles as well. And we have a similar transit rule. So the governor's executive order sort of mirrored what's already in regulation on the medium and heavy duty side, but set that new target on the light duty side. And we recognize it's not going to be easy to do this, and this is new technology, and we're at a very small percentage of sales currently, but we're working very hard to move forward our strategy for enacting all of the complementary policies to make this a reality.
Hannah, you hit on what I wanted to follow up with after Carter and Spencer spoke, really about the interplay between markets and policy. If we could just stick on the state and local here. Spencer, not to throw your words back at you, but you said we're no longer in the world where the RPS is driving, or an RPS is driving things on the renewables side. I'm just curious, you know, as we look at the ambition and the level of renewables that will need to be built in the next decade, right, to keep pace with some of the IPCC targets, how does Duke look at that interplay? And I think you probably know where I'm coming from the environmental and climate advocate perspective. You know, we come from a very strong belief that policy and really strong policy is needed. But I'm curious if you could follow up on that comment, given that timeline that we're on, and Carter, you as well, and Hannah, if there's anything else you'd like to say with respect to that, please go third.
Well, look, I think state policy drives all of it. So if I didn't mean to diminish state policy. In fact, we've got utilities in 6 different states. So we're going to be working with those stakeholders in each of those states to figure out the right mix for those states. Now, North Carolina is number 2 in solar. There are about 7,000 megawatts of solar operating here in the state. Some of it we own, some of it we don't. And, we're expecting that to double. So we'll have about 16,000 megawatts by 2025. Now that's largely based on what the stakeholders want and what the businesses here want. It might be a little different in Indiana. It might be a little different in Ohio, Kentucky, Florida, South Carolina. So we have the challenge of providing, a cost of service rate in each of those jurisdictions based on what all of those customers really want. And we have stepped back in the last couple of years to really say, let's step back and let's present the options to them. And then let's go talk to them and figure out what are the trade-offs? What are the trade-offs with gas, with wind, with solar? And we're in the process of doing that in each of those jurisdictions in a way that I think is comprehensive. It's a way I'm really proud of. I think it's a way that is going to give us longer term growth in renewables and, providing clean, affordable power to our customers in each of those jurisdictions, but it's going to look different in each of those states. So that's going to be based on state policy, and the state policy is different in each of those states. So we have the challenge of also trying to adapt and provide the resources to keep the power on and keep the lights on 24/7 in each of those jurisdictions. So it's a challenge, but it's one that I think we're really stepping up to, and we're doing it in a way that is really from the grassroots up, instead of sort of this is what we think we should do, and so this is what we're going to do. And it's a refreshing approach, and it engages environmental stakeholders and public advocates and cost advocates, industrial customers, wholesale customers. And I think we'll see it'll look a little different in each of those states, but the overall goal is to get to net zero by 2050. And by 2030, we're hoping to be at about a 50% carbon rate.
Yeah, I on the state policy side, I mean, I think I agree and voiced, similar opinion that there's sort of a groundswell of sort of other action that's kind of, I think, leading or pushing or maybe hitting a critical mass. You know, on the state side, I think there are so many. I mean, we classically, as especially like us environmental lawyers, VLS trained folks, think about like RPS and RGGI and other sort of goals that that policymakers can set. But I think the other side of the coin is all of the policies that the states have that are impediments to renewable development as well. And those are really important to sort of think about and be aware of. And you know, especially kind of as we're going into some states that may not be, you know, those sort of leading states. There are rules around, you know, securitization of coal facilities and stranded assets. There are tax rules about sort of partnerships and how renewable companies versus sort of your classic fossil fuel energy companies can sort of shelter or manage their tax liabilities. So there are a lot of other policies out there that I think need to actually be sort of considered and broken down in an effort to allow renewables to have sort of the open kind of landscape and the competitive opportunities that a lot of fossil fuels have been. And it's sort of under the radar screener. It's not your classic subsidy, but just another whole slew of state policies that I think are really important. And the other side is sort of allowing customers to have access to renewable procurement. So a lot of states will require that a renewable product is sold through a utility, and that the utility is the only one serving a retail customer or a, you know, an industrial customer. And there are many benefits to that, but there are also some drawbacks in terms of who the renewable, you know, IPPs and or other you know, other renewable producers can actually reach in terms of a customer base. And you know, we have found a lot of customers who would really like to increase their renewable load, but they're having a hard time actually sort of transitioning or figuring out how to do that through a utility. So no offense to Spencer or Duke, but you know, there are a lot of state policies that actually need to be broken down to release the sort of impediments to renewable generation, not just drive sort of a policy or a encouragement of renewables. So just another thought on state policy and federal too. But
maybe with that, I can actually turn the next question over to Hannah, and just jumping over to federal policy in general. You had mentioned the clean energy stimulus. How much is California banking on a clean energy stimulus package next year to move your transportation decarbonization goals forward?
I can't speak for all of California, but I would say we are hopeful, but not expecting anything. So we really have to set our policies in a way that they can survive no matter what happens federally. Obviously, it would be nice if the federal government provided that support, and if we could leverage stimulus funding to move clean energy forward, as well as things like the clean vehicle rebate or tax credit at the federal level. Sorry, our state one is a rebate, but the federal is a tax credit. And things like that, continuing to expand those programs or raise caps on manufacturers. We'd like to see things like that happen. We do modify our policy strategies based on what's happening at the federal level. So if we can rely on federal stimulus or other policies, we can shift our focus to other more pressing issues that maybe we couldn't have looked at before. But I think sort of regardless, we'll continue to move forward. I don't know if that I'm missing the second piece of your question, maybe.
No, that was it. I mean, we could talk about broader congressional action. We know what's on Joe Biden's platform, but I think that's maybe a conversation for another day. But Carter, curious if Ranger is holding on to hope for that stimulus as well.
It's actually so I sort of got my renewable career started with a company called First Wind just a year or so after I left Vermont Law School, and I think our CEO Paul Gaynor was really active in AWEA. He was on the board, and I think that even in sort of the 2012, 13, 14, there was discussion of the wind tax credits phasing out, and I think there was really starting to be sort of a movement towards kind of what do we do after? How do we move beyond kind of a government subsidy? And even though you can make a lot of arguments about, the government subsidy is called one thing on one side, and it's just a tax, these master limited partnership, it's just another form of subsidy on the other side. And I think there was a lot of language around making sure that we're sort of shifting the conversation to how do we create a competitive landscape where these assets are not necessarily in that sort of, infant needing to be supported mode, but really how do we move beyond that? And I really actually I think that I have kind of sort of built that philosophy into my kind of regulatory philosophy, that I think there are some, strict environmental rules that we need to put down. We need to have certain principles. The Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, like all these things need to be really strictly enforced. And yet I do hope that we can kind of move into an area where a lot of the subsidies and these sort of, financial support mechanisms are going towards some of these newer technologies, some of the storage technologies, some of the, the kind of grid modernization and management technologies and software packages, that we can push some of those financial structures. But I really do think that, wind and solar have both dropped in cost. Storage is doing the same. And, moving into an area where we don't have to have those sort of RPS or sort of subsidization arguments, that is actually more my hope than a hope on a specific sort of federal package that I think is, just a different way of messaging certain, financial packages, like whether it's a tax credit or a, limited partnership type tax shelter or whatnot. Like, I wish we could have a more open conversation about it, but I do hope that we can kind of move beyond that and again, within sort of environmental guidelines or sort of bookends, that we can sort of move all these technologies forward. And I think the consumer base is really ready for that.
If I can jump in, Sam.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think we have been on a little bit of a, it's been a roller coaster with the PTCs, production tax credits and investment tax credits for all these different technologies getting turned on and turned off every 2 years. We did see the last couple of years provide the most like constant growth because they got extended for a certain period of time. And the Treasury extended them one more year because of COVID impacts, which I think was the right thing to do. But I think another thing that really needs, if we're going to meet the targets to, reduce or, negate the impacts of climate change, we're going to need to put more and more renewables out there. And I think it's estimated to be about 16 gigawatts this year, but I've seen numbers of twice that amount in order to reduce the climate change impact from a 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. And in order to do that, there's two things that need to happen. We need to have thoughtful permitting reform, and we also need to expand our transmission system. And right now, in parts of the country, I'm taking my utility hat off now and putting my developer hat on. But we are waiting in interconnection queues for 4 or 5 years before we can develop a wind or solar farm. So that's not workable. That means that something has to change in terms of getting more renewables on the grid, and just putting the interconnection. That's my yellow lab. Just putting the interconnection stuff aside, we're going to have to continue to build relationships with local communities and environmental groups. I sit on the board of the American Wind Wildlife Institute. It's a great organization of environmental groups like NRDC and Audubon and National Wildlife Federation, and utilities and developers. And we get together, and the whole premise of the thing is to use science to answer questions for how to reduce the impacts to wildlife from wind. And we've been successful doing that, but we've got to do that across all the technologies, or else we're going to fall short achieving the renewables goals we want to achieve, and environmental groups are going to fall short in terms of, getting the carbon reductions and the greenhouse gas reductions they want.
Thanks, Spencer. I'd like to ask one more question, and then I see all the questions in the Q&A coming in, so I want to get to those quickly. So maybe we can do this one kind of fast. But getting back, Carter, to your initial point about equity, I wanted just to dig into the roles that each of you see for your sector. I think we can all agree that the way we've historically developed our energy resources in the US, as well as our transportation system, our buildings, et cetera, have created a lot of inequities, and that people of color are disproportionately experiencing health and economic impacts. So what is the role of the energy industry? What is the role of each of your sectors to address some of those longstanding inequities? So Carter, can we start with you?
Sure. So I think, it's funny. I think that I sort of traditionally, and maybe, I'm starting to shift my thinking this year. But I think that I traditionally felt like I'm, out there, I'm doing renewable energy development, and therefore I'm like saving the environment, and I'm righting all these wrongs of these coal facilities being built in these, sort of harming specific communities. And I think, I think that philosophy is probably strong across the Ranger Power team. I think we all feel that way. And yet I think this year has really sort of just kind of jostled that a lot for us and made us rethink that, and that it's not, it's not enough just to be building solar facilities. We have to really make sure that we are sort of walking the walk across all areas. And, we're a small team, but we have been talking about making sure that we are reaching out to, to internship and job opportunities in areas that are not just sort of a friend of a friend that we know from, law school or our communities or where we went to college, but really seeking out, not just sort of candidates from other backgrounds, but really making sure that we're thinking actively about the opportunities and sort of how we're sort of looking for new people to join our team. And I'll just put a plug out there that we have an intern from a company called Genesis Works. And if you want to look into them, they're great. I'm happy to answer more questions. But we really sort of actively tried to build out a team, in terms of the Ranger Power team that's sort of beyond what we would normally think about. And I think we're just trying to educate ourselves beyond just sort of, being somewhat, progressive, sort of forward-thinking people that we all think we are. We've really tried to move beyond that. So we're, trying to create those lists and think about that work in addition to just doing renewable energy. And we've also thought about sort of carbon offsets and how do we make sure that even though we're building solar facilities, we're doing a little bit more than what is our typical day-to-day. So I think it's, again, just a shift to make sure that, just sort of doing your job and thinking that you're doing a great job or that you're thinking correctly, it's not enough. We've really tried to push in the other direction. So.
And Hannah, if you could take this next.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are a lot of parallels to be drawn between the renewable energy sort of rise as well as zero emission vehicles. We're sort of behind and learning a lot of lessons from the renewable energy takeover, and particularly solar in California. On the permitting front, we sort of had the same bill go forward for solar permit streamlining, and then we modeled the electric vehicle charging station permit streamlining bill off of solar. And we see that as well sort of on the social equity side. We have a very strong presence in California for environmental justice stakeholders, which I think is a great benefit to our policymaking. I can give sort of one example in California. So in our zero emission vehicle funding related programs, and that's coming from sort of state funding, or even if that's utility funding that's approved by our Public Utilities Commission, there are always quantifiable percentages around how much of that funding has to go to what we call in California disadvantaged communities. It's not a popular term, and I think we're working to revamp that. But currently that sort of means communities that are identified by a tool we call Cal Enviro Screen, which uses a number of different factors to identify communities that have historically been overly burdened by pollution and other issues. And those communities, as you can imagine, tend to be along freight corridors and near ports and areas like that. And so our legislature has passed policies governing pretty much any funding that goes into zero emission vehicle projects. And for the funding that our Air Resources Board gives out, they require that 50% of that funding goes to benefit those vulnerable communities. And beyond that, not just benefit, but also provide funding for projects that are located in and benefiting the individuals living in those communities. And they have to track that and report it. And I think there are many positive things from this funding going out in that manner, but it sort of makes you think, from the bureaucratic perspective about going after more creative solutions, which is really great to see. And we often see that we exceed that 50% for programs. And we try not to, I think a lot of folks in the zero emission vehicle policy arena in the early days had the similar viewpoint of the more electric and hydrogen vehicles we get out there, the cleaner the air is, it's better for everyone. But that's not enough. If our legislators are seeing more and more Tesla drivers, those Tesla drivers are not the folks that are living in these communities. So that's not helpful. So we do focus it in that way. I think one really unique program in California, it's called Clean Cars for All. And it's a partnership between air districts and state funding that is a scrap and replace program for low income folks in these communities. They can trade in their old car, they can get a transit pass, they don't have to get a vehicle. They can get another mobility sort of solution, and then they could also get a new or used vehicle, and it allows incentive stacking. So I think they can get up to almost $10,000 towards a new vehicle to replace their old polluting vehicle that no longer passes smog. So we have a lot of creative solutions like that, and we're focusing more on mobility and not just vehicle ownership, because increasing vehicle miles traveled is not benefiting anyone if we're putting more people in single passenger cars with California's traffic and other issues. So focusing on transit and car sharing and things like that too.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I'm going to jump to the questions that we're getting from the audience here, and keep them coming. I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of them, but we will do our best. So the first one is a very broad question. Other than policy, what are the biggest hurdles to moving to 100% clean energy? I think we can extend that to transportation as well. This asker says, it seems the biggest hurdle is cost, that the needed technology already exists. Do you feel that's true? So why don't we start with you, Spencer, from the utility perspective?
Yeah, it's really interesting. We have wind farms in Wyoming and Oklahoma and Texas and Kansas and Pennsylvania and elsewhere. And state policymakers have a very different view towards renewables in each of those places. In Wyoming, they added a generation tax to wind after we got our start in wind in Wyoming. Built about 300 or 400 megawatts of wind there. And then they came and taxed our generation after we made these investments. And so we said, look, I don't think we're going to invest there anymore, because we need certainty in where we make investments. So we have been one of the few companies to kind of publicly state, we're not going to develop any more wind in Wyoming. We're going to go to states that are more favorable and actually want us to make investments in their communities. So we've probably invested over $2 billion in wind in between Oklahoma and Texas since Wyoming did that. So I think, states are going to address this. They're going to address this differently. Now, why did Wyoming do that? I mean, yes, they rely on coal significantly, but you could have made the same argument that they would be attracting more investment from wind and solar if they had just put the right policies in place. So, not all states look at these opportunities the same. Some of them have incumbent interests that frame how they look at them. And, but I think the arc of where all of this is going is pretty clear, which is there's going to be more wind and more solar, and there's going to be some gas because we've got to balance all that out, but increasingly it's going to be more wind, solar, and storage in these states. And that's what you see in Texas. Oklahoma's moving forward. Kansas, I mean, a lot of states are moving forward because they've realized these are good paying jobs. The wind technicians are the fastest growing jobs in the United States right now. And, you know, there's economic benefit to the local schools and the local counties. And that's even more important now because of COVID.
You want me to jump in?
Please.
There are a couple of questions here about that I'm seeing sort of on kind of reliability and transmission and interconnection rules at FERC. And, you know, the good thing about the electric industry getting through COVID is that we are like this big driving force that is just going to like keep on keeping on, and we're going to be there, and it's needed, and everybody knows that. And we have sort of a certain amount of job security in electricity. The bad part about that is that it is like this really, really slow moving train that has been kind of going down this road for a really long time. It needs a lot of new energy, and it needs a lot of new thinking. And I think that is sort of like for the electric industry to sort of grow up a little bit into like the next phase, or maybe grow young a little bit with some new sort of energization. You know, we really need to think about it differently. We need to think about transmission differently and building new technologies onto the grid. Like, we have the opportunity to fix all of these problems, and they're actually not that hard. Like, storage is going to fix a huge amount of problems. There's software technology out there that's modernizing grids from a micro level to a macro level that is going to solve a lot of these problems. Like, it is so possible, and there's so much opportunity there. And I hope that, like, you know, everybody thinks about a career in energy. But I really think it's just a mind shift. It's like, you need to get over the idea that, you know, coal's now expensive and solar is less expensive and storage is coming on to fix these problems. And like, we just need to be a little bit more, I think, flexible and ready to kind of take on that future. And it's like, it's right there. So that's the biggest impediment, I think, is this sort of mindset. And I'm ready for us to move into the next one. So let's go.
A culture change, Carter. It sounds like you're asking
so
for.
Easy, right? That's
yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to weigh in on that one quickly too.
Please.
So I think one of from folks sort of looking at California from outside California with the zero emission vehicle executive order recently, that was part of the impetus for that executive order was because of our devastating fire season this year and the impacts of climate change on the state, and really needing to do more to help reduce that in later years and deal with climate change. But part of that too, there's sort of this complicated web of issues with our electric system and reliability, and, you know, shutting parts of the electric system off in order to avoid potential wildfire in rural areas, as well as we've had some issues this year with extreme heat around times that we weren't necessarily ready for, where there were alerts called for people to reduce their energy usage. And so that makes people say, you know, well, if we're going to transition to a ton of electric vehicles, can our grid support that? Is it going to be reliable and resilient? And I agree with Carter, we have to think about this more flexibly. And electric vehicles and hydrogen production, there really can be a grid asset. You can leverage these vehicles particularly for a fleet use, maybe not everyone at their own home, even though I think folks would like to be able to use their vehicle to power their house. And that happens occasionally in different areas, maybe not so much in the US. But we're looking at that from a vehicle grid integration standpoint, both affecting consumer behavior, the folks who are charging those batteries to be in line with grid conditions and renewable energy production. And then also in the future, we're currently figuring out how to do this actual V2G part, where you can use the vehicle's energy to put it back on the grid during times of need, which could be a great storage asset, like Carter was talking about. So moving to these clean energy technologies really allows us more flexibility and more options to deal with issues that we're all seeing, but we need to do it faster, and we need to figure out how to get everyone to work together and sort of let down a little of their hesitancy, which I think we see a lot in this space.
That is a great segue to the next question I wanted to ask, which is about distributed energy resources. So speaking of flexibility and this more dynamic clean energy grid, where we're going to take the distribution system, right, and use it to balance what we're seeing on the large scale renewable side. So are there concerns when you think about DERs and all of this new technology that's going to be happening behind the meter and on the distribution system. Are there valid concerns about grid reliability that you see arising? And maybe Spencer, we can start with you and then go to the other three speakers.
You know, we acquired a distributed generation company 3 or 4 years ago. It's called REC Solar, and they're doing a lot of commercial rooftop solar projects in California, Hawaii. We've done some microgrid projects in Boston, and one for Montgomery County in Maryland. And you know, I think your question is about how do we balance all those distributed generation resources, and it's a little different for Duke. I mean, we are ultimately the balancing authority as the utility in each of our states, and so that's our job to figure out how to do that, and we do it. You know, outside of those, outside of our utilities and where we're vertically integrated, we're leaning more and more on RTOs and ISOs to help figure out how distributed resources can get integrated into the grid. And it's hard. You know, these are stakeholder-driven entities that have lots of different opinions and stakeholder groups. And I think that's an area that a lot of companies, a lot of developers are focusing their attention on, so that we can get the rules fixed, so that we can get more distributed resources on the grid, and then the balancing authorities and the ISOs and RTOs can figure out how to use those resources, stack them up, and make sure that they're there when we need them. So I think it's happening. It's painful at times, because whenever you're in a stakeholder process, it's painful, but that's the game. And I think a lot of companies are working on how to figure out how to improve that process so we can get more of these resources on the grid.
I think to add, you know, two big pieces are that there's, you know, the state. I actually, when I give like interconnection transmission like 101s or electricity 101s, I actually typically start with like my going back to constitutional law class and the federal versus state jurisdiction. And, you know, those are still like at loggerheads where, you know, the states don't want to give up their jurisdiction over the DERs, and there's utilities. And yet the ISOs and the RTOs are like, well, how the heck are we supposed to model, you know, 2,000, 3,000 megawatts of distributed generation in Massachusetts? And I think North Carolina has a lot of, you know, sort of sub-utility scale solar. So that is, you know, that is a big impediment. And I think the other impediment with distributed energy, and it's actually, I mean, it's not unique to distributed energy, but is the sort of grid modernization and building out the transmission system. And I don't mean just a wires transmission system, but building out the electrical grid so that we can facilitate, you know, that sort of smooth transition and make sure that, you know, we don't have those reliability problems. And, you know, I liken it to sort of, you know, infrastructure in any economy. You have to sort of think about the infrastructure that you're building on the scale with what kind of economic benefits you're enabling. And the electric system in and of itself and the future of electrification of our economy is, I mean, it's massive. Like, we just have a massive economy, a massive amount of it flows on the electrical system. And so actually investing, and that's another sort of cultural change, is like putting what are very, very big investments on both the distributed system, the transmission system as a whole, and getting everybody to work well together is really, really challenging, but it's possible.
Thanks, Carter. Hannah, care to weigh in on that question?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I agree with what the prior folks said, and I think I have sort of an interesting background on this, because prior to coming to the state, again, I was advocating for and sort of consulting for a trade association for electric vehicles, which included, our board was all utilities in California and manufacturers of vehicles and charging stations. And so I have a lot of empathy for some of the more conservative moving ideas around moving to this, because, you know, if you're a utility, you really have to be able to provide a consistent, reliable service to your customers at a reasonable price, and in following a lot of rules and that are set out by your regulator. And I get that it's challenging to think about moving towards things that you don't have a ton of experience with, or that have a lot of shift with how technologies work, and it's not as reliable as the sort of generation that has been relied on in the past. And I think that those sorts of entities, the sort of long-standing historical entities, they're seeing that they have to do that, and they're doing pilots and moving forward in that way, at least on the zero emission vehicle side, to figure it out. But I mean, having written comment letters to our PUC sort of opposing faster progress, and now being in this position, it's hard. I totally get it. I think we have to do it in a way that's safe, in a way that works for all of the consumers, but we also have to figure out how to move faster, because we need to fight climate change. So there are ways to do that. And I mean, the stakeholder process is sort of like pulling teeth, as Spencer said. And there are a lot of different viewpoints, and there's a lot of competition inherent in that, and infighting over what the outcome might be. So we have to balance all of that, and it's challenging, but I think we're all moving forward in mostly positive ways.
Yeah, and just to add to that, resource diversity helps. So in North Carolina, we have a very large pump storage facility that we use when we lose solar resources in Eastern North Carolina. We're able to, balance that out through larger, pump storage facilities. So that's been really beneficial. But having solar sort of geographically diverse is also or any resource, right? Having it geographically diverse helps grid operators balance that out too. And we're seeing more and more of that. But I do think we're going to see more distributed generation on the grid in the future to help us manage those resources. And that's going to be a cost. There's going to be a cost to doing that, whether they're fuel cells or California is looking at offshore wind, which is coincident with the peak, so that could balance out their resources over time. And I mean, those are all the things that we're going to have to look at. Energy efficiency and DSM programs can help and have helped. There was a question in the comments on that, and I think we get about 1% of our control of our resource from energy efficiency, which is a big deal. But I think all these technologies, and then investing in like the next generation of technologies, is also important. We've seen increases in DOE funding for the next generation of solar, and they're looking at other things as well. So I think all of those things are going to help us figure out the most cost-effective, clean system going forward.
Thank you, Spencer. And I suppose that's why we're calling this a paradigm shift, right? From this big centralized grid that we built out 100 years ago to something much more dynamic and two-way. There's a bunch more questions in here. We don't have time for them, but I just wanted to highlight a few, and perhaps folks can correspond with the panelists over email. I did want to mention Charlotte Cohn's plug for energy efficiency and demand response. I'm a huge energy efficiency proponent, so I just wanted to put it out there. We haven't talked about it much today, that efficiency and DR can provide substantial grid level value in terms of reducing demand and GHGs, and in integrating large scale renewables as well. And Hannah, there was a question for you about California's Clean Air Act waiver for the Advanced Clean Trucks rule and the most recent executive order. So perhaps you can talk to that individual offline about whether California does indeed need to get that waiver, a legal question there. And Spencer and Carter, there's a question here about alleviating bottlenecks for projects using some of the FERC jurisdictional interconnection processes. I think we'll just put a pin in that. And Spencer, a bunch of questions for you about small modular nuclear reactors. So let's just maybe have that conversation a different time. But I just wanted to note that there's a real diversity of questions and comments coming up from our participants. So I think with that, we are unfortunately out of time. I want to just thank everyone on the panel for this really great conversation. I feel so honored to be part of this VLS community and all of us who are in the energy industry doing this really, really important work. And thank you again to all three of you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. And with that, I'm going to introduce Dan Delurey, who's going to speak next. Dan is a senior fellow for climate and energy with the Institute for Energy and the Environment at VLS. So he is a leader in the electric industry in areas that include energy efficiency, clean energy, demand response, grid mod, all the things we've just been talking about. He has experience in both policy and programs. His most recent work was in heading up Wedgmere, and he founded the Association for Demand Response and Smart Grid, which is the first industry coalition focused on what were then emerging areas. And like I said, he's now a fellow at VLS. Dan, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Samantha. I would also add to my resume that I grew up near Bennington, Vermont, and I split my time now between Vermont and Washington, D.C. I've been a fellow since last year. Due to COVID, I haven't had a chance to meet as many people at VLS as I would like to, but looking forward to doing that once we get out of this. So I'm in DC today, and there's a saying in DC that everything's been said, but not everyone has said it. I'm going to avoid that today. What you just heard was an incredible discussion full of substance and insight. And I commend everyone for that. It was spectacular. But what I want to do, and what I've been asked to do, is to sort of pick up on a few things, be they themes or individual things that were said, and maybe try and connect them to other things or make my own observations on those particular areas. So excuse me if I look at my notes, they're copious based on that chat we just heard. But I think the first thing that I want to pick up on is several people mentioned, if not by name, environmental justice. And I think it was Spencer that mentioned early on that what we have now is a situation where, EJ issues and adverse impacts of a lot of things in the energy world have always been there, but they were kind of swept under the rug or set off to the side. And I think now we see that they are one of the main issues that are being discussed when other things are being discussed. I think the thing that I would add in this is there's also the other side of the coin for environmental justice. You want to, on the one hand, avoid the adverse impacts, but on the other hand, you want to make sure that these disadvantaged communities are involved in the upside or the plus side as we move to clean energy, especially including energy efficiency. And so I think there's a lot that can be done that has not been done in those areas. The second thing is to talk about jobs. Samantha mentioned that and gave some statistics early on. And the thing about jobs in the political or policy sense is they're an important currency, but they're an unbalanced currency because an existing job lost seems to be worth more than a new job that might be created. And of course, an existing job lost means an actual person, an actual voter. The other type of job is a prospective unknown person. I think what's significant, and back to Samantha citing those numbers, is that we've now seen significant job loss in the clean energy industry, particularly with respect to energy efficiency. And so you now have a situation of it's not just all in the future, it's there now, and that creates a potent advocacy weapon when it comes to all of these other things that we're trying to do. I'm glad to see energy efficiency getting a shout out, because of those 600,000 jobs that were lost due to the pandemic, almost 500,000 were in energy efficiency. And I would just note that that kind of highlights what will be a continuing discussion over the definition of clean energy. Now, obviously, energy efficiency fits in, but there are some other things that have been a little bit more disputed. And certainly things are starting to bubble when it comes to natural gas. Some, if not all of you, are probably aware of the natural gas bans that have been put in place in certain municipalities around the country. So I think, and one other thing to note is in the area of hydro, which surprisingly has not always been considered green energy or clean energy. And we don't have time to go into that, but recently the National Hydro Association entered into an agreement with the American Rivers Association and many others. And that will kind of have them all working together, trying to make sure that the existing hydro resource is not lost, and maybe there's some hydro resources to come. In terms of states, and everyone talked about states, and certainly it's good news that the states have been an engine of creativity and activity when it comes to clean energy over the past 10 years. We haven't had a federal energy policy bill since 2007. We had the stimulus of 2009, and that did a lot, put a lot of money directly in the states and so on. But that is something that we have to keep, even whatever kind of a federal stimulus bill we get. And I do think we're going to get one. I know Hannah talked about California not counting on it, and there certainly are a lot of people in Washington who don't like California. And so maybe it depends on who wins next Tuesday, but I think there will be a stimulus bill. And I think a lot of that will go to the states, and hopefully will go to the states, because as was mentioned by several people, state budgets have been terribly impacted by COVID. States by law have to balance their budget. The federal government does not. And there are cases in the past of where states have robbed from Peter to pay Paul, where Peter was a clean energy fund or energy efficiency funds or something like that. So I think that's the importance of federal legislation in that area. Next, Spencer talked about permitting early on, and then he came back around to it. And one of the new things with permitting is the rise of, and you may have heard this acronym, of bananas, which is build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. It's sort of gone beyond the NIMBY phase. So you have real issues with the siting of solar, wind, certainly pipelines and so on. And I think if we're going to do this thing of decarbonization as fast as we would like to, and I'll argue in a moment as fast as we need to, then you have to solve the local permitting issue. It can't just all be a federal mandate that we're going to do this, and it can't all be setting standards, whether they be corporate or state clean energy standards. The rubber hits the road when it gets local, when you're talking about actual projects and actual communities. So one thing in terms of the effect of the pandemic, which I wanted to pick up on, and that was Spencer giving us the number of employees who are working from home at his company. And I think certainly we don't know what all the impacts of COVID will be on the electricity industry, on clean energy. But one of the ones that I'm watching, and I think is evidenced by some of the announcements you've seen of people working from home, and also Spencer's numbers, is that we may be looking at a substantial relocation of electricity demand. So far this year, residential electricity use is up 20% over last year. And so this has implications for all sorts of things, including a utility distribution system, I suppose. So I think that's something we all have to watch and see how much of a permanent impact that is as a result of the pandemic. I guess the final thing I want to talk about here, there was all sorts of good talk about, Samantha several times talked about the emergency of all of this and talked about ambitions and so on. I think one thing that the pandemic has demonstrated to us, and you heard more about this earlier in the year, is that it's going to be really hard to reduce emissions on the timetable that we need to. And you can pick that timetable that Samantha alluded to of the 1.5, according to the IPCC and the Paris Accord. And we know that emissions have dropped, but we also know why they've dropped this year. And so if we're not going to have a pandemic and still reduce emissions, then we've got quite a job ahead of us. And I think what's important for all of us to think about when it comes to emissions is what net zero really means. The net zero standards that are being set across the country and by cities and so on really is talking about a net zero balance in the year 2050. So how you get there is not being talked about as much. Now, Spencer noted that they've got an interim milestone of 2030. But just to take two extreme examples, if you were to achieve only 10% of your decarbonization by, let's say, the year 2045, and then did all of the rest in that last 5 years, well, that would be great. But if it goes the other way, if you're really not, or if you, you get it, the other way, then you you have to focus on the concentrations. And so the earlier that emissions goes up into the atmosphere, then the more is there. And as we all know, the longer it stays. And so I think we're really in a race here, and all of the good things, all of the activity that everyone talked about here is significant, but just doing good things or just doing the right things may not be enough. It's the pace at which we do them. And right now, as I see it, the pace of doing things is not on the same pace as the required emissions reductions, according to the various metrics that I've mentioned. So I think with that, I would, say that what you've heard here is a little bit of a call to action, that there's all sorts of work to be done. There's all sorts of opportunity to do it, but we really have to speed it up a bit. And I will stop there and hand it over to Dan Phillips.
Thanks, Dan. And hey, everyone, Dan Phillips here, VLS class of 04. Sorry I missed you on the front end, but happy to be here on the back end. I think this, without a doubt, has been our best symposium yet. It's our 7th year doing this, and I get so excited because I feel like I'm back in Soro, hanging out with my friends, chatting about the most amazing subjects we can all think about. And the only difference now is, I knew you guys were smart when we were in school, but man, you guys are all experts in your field. Sam, Carter, Hannah, Spencer, you guys are just blowing me away. Thank you for your insights today. Dan, for your summary and the closing words. It's awesome to be part of the VLS Alumni Energy Group and to stay connected with everyone. We couldn't do it without our sponsors. Thank you, Brian and the folks over at Perkins Coie, the team over in the alumni office, Crystal and Molly, who make this happen, but especially to Kevin Jones, who without his connection between the alumni and the students and faculty wouldn't be possible. So Kevin, thank you for your continued support. And I guess I'll close out this year's symposium the same way I close out everyone. Thank you so much for your participation this year in our 7th annual symposium. And I can't wait to see you all again at our 8th. Thank you very much.